What if the reason you are not wealthy has nothing to do with how hard you work and everything to do with a single equation you have never been taught? Scott Galloway, the NYU Stern professor behind the Prof G Pod and the Pivot podcast, wrote The Algebra of Wealth after watching an entire generation get sold the same broken advice his generation was sold. Inside this masterclass, you will discover the exact formula he uses to define economic security and 2 questions that will follow you the entire way through. Here is the first question worth sitting with. If talent matters more than passion, why does almost nobody tell you that before you choose a career? And here is the second. If wealth is really just an equation, why do so many intelligent, hardworking people still feel like they are losing the game? Stay with us because both of those questions get answered, and the second answer is the one that will actually change how you operate starting this week. Before we open the case file on this book, if you believe knowledge should function as a genuine, unfair advantage rather than entertainment, make sure you subscribe to the Book Vault and tap that like button right now. We release strategic breakdowns built for people who refuse to stay average. Now, let's open the file on a formula that reduces an entire economic life into 4 variables, because what Galloway uncovered when he built this equation is far more unsettling than most readers expect. Stoicism. This investigation begins with the variable Galloway places first in his equation, and the chapter he simply calls Stoicism. Inside the vault, we call this the character audit, because before any formula about money can work, the person running it has to be honest about their own behavior. Galloway is direct about why this chapter exists at all. He has openly admitted that what kept him from economic security for much of his life was a stubborn belief that he was exceptional, a belief the market kept reinforcing every time he raised money or appeared in a magazine profile. That confession is uncomfortable to hear, and it should be. Most people listening right now believe they are the exception to their own bad habits, but deep down, you already suspect you are not. Galloway draws on Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, not as decoration, but as a practical operating system because Stoics treated character as the highest pursuit a person could chase. The terrifying part is that most people never notice the pattern happening to them in real time. They believe restraint is a personality trait when it is actually a discipline that has to be built daily. This is where mainstream advice collapses because most financial content treats spending as a math problem instead of a psychological one. Galloway names the real opponent directly, pointing out that capitalism's genius is inventing new things for us to spend money on that feel like needs instead of wants. Read that twice, because it reframes every unnecessary purchase you have made this year. What feels like survival is often manufactured desire, engineered by companies that profit from your inability to distinguish the two. That sounds bleak, almost insulting to hear out loud. But once you accept it, something shifts, because it means the entire battlefield of wealth creation is internal before it is ever external. Galloway frames the relevant Stoic virtues as courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, and argues temperance matters most inside a consumption culture built to override it. The next variable in the equation will not work for you at all if this one stays broken, and that connection is exactly where the book turns next. And what I'm about to tell you is the part of this book that most people never even reach, because the next variable dismantles the most repeated lie in career advice. Focus. The next variable Galloway introduces becomes the most quietly controversial idea in the entire book, and he calls it focus. Now we enter the part of the formula concerned with earning, because as Galloway bluntly puts it, you are going to need a decent amount of income before any of the rest of this equation has anything to multiply. Inside the vault, we treat this chapter as a direct challenge to one of the most repeated phrases in modern career advice, the instruction to simply follow your passion wherever it leads you. Galloway dismantles that advice with a level of bluntness rarely heard from a business professor. In a conversation on the Rational Reminder podcast, he explained that people often mistake their passion for a hobby, and those hobbies tend to sit inside genuinely terrible paying industries. He has been candid that he personally wanted to make his living as an athlete until UCLA disabused him of that notion almost immediately. What comes next is the part most readers never forget, because his real target is not passion itself, but who tends to be selling it to you. Most people think the people preaching passion are simply being generous with their wisdom. In reality, Galloway argues, when someone tells you to follow your passion, it usually means they are already rich, often from some unglamorous field like iron ore smelting. On Medium, in a piece directly tied to this book, he adds a sobering detail, noting that only an estimated 20% of people can even identify one singular passion and that 97% of professional actors cannot make a living from their craft alone. And late at night, when you finally put the phone down, a quiet voice tends to show up, doesn't it? A voice that asks whether the thing you call your passion was ever actually a viable plan, or just a story that felt safer than admitting you needed a strategy. Galloway's answer is not cynical. He insists that once you become great at something you are naturally talented for, the admiration, the income, and the camaraderie that follow will eventually make you passionate about it anyway, which completely reverses the order most people were taught to follow. Time. We now arrive at the variable Galloway considers the most unforgiving in the entire formula, the chapter he titles simply Time. If you leave with nothing else from this video, let it be this single distinction, because Galloway frames time as the one true currency every person receives at birth in equal measure, regardless of background, talent, or luck. Unlike money, unlike opportunity, time cannot be borrowed, refunded, or recovered once it has been spent carelessly, which is precisely why this chapter sits at the structural center of the entire equation. Inside this chapter, Galloway introduces a practical tool reviewers consistently highlight, something he calls the Waterline Budget, a method for determining the actual floor spending a person needs to survive before anything else gets allocated. He extends this into a system of daily, intermediate, and long-term consumption buckets, forcing a kind of triage on every dollar earned. Most people think budgeting is about restriction. The deeper layer most readers miss is that Galloway is really describing a system for protecting future time, not present comfort, and this next realization is the exact moment everything splits into before and after for most readers. Compounding does not care how talented you are, how charismatic you are, or how badly you intend to start later. It only responds to elapsed time, which means every single year of delay is not a neutral pause, it is an active subtraction from your future security. Today is the youngest you will ever be again, and that sentence should feel less like a motivational poster and more like a quiet, specific warning. But here's where the chapter becomes almost cruel in its honesty, and then immediately turns generous again. Galloway points directly at social media, describing it on his platform as likely one of history's great wealth destroyers because it robs young people of the exact years when investing in real relationships and serious work could have been compounding silently in the background. That thought feels heavy, almost accusatory, but once you accept it, you realize it also means the fix is not complicated. It simply requires you to reclaim attention before the next decade quietly disappears the same way the last one did. Here is the truth most ambitious people never admit. The years you are losing to distraction right now are not recoverable, and the math does not care how good your intentions are. The next chapter contains the only structural defense that actually works against that reality, and if you ignore it, everything else you have learned so far becomes irrelevant. Diversification. We now enter the chapter titled Diversification, and before we step into the final and longest chapter inside this formula, there is a number worth sitting with for a moment. What you are about to hear is the part of this book most casual readers skim past entirely, even though it is the chapter Galloway built to outlast every other piece of advice he gives. He titles it Diversification and treats it as a full working introduction to financial markets, covering stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities, currency, derivatives, and funds inside one unified philosophy of risk. The core instruction reviewers consistently extract from this chapter is precise almost to the point of being a rule rather than a suggestion. Galloway advises spreading capital across genuinely uncorrelated assets, with no single holding exceeding roughly 3% of the total portfolio. This is not timidity. This is what most people mistake for caution, when in reality it is one of the only mathematically proven defenses against the specific kind of catastrophic loss that erases decades of disciplined saving in a single bad year. This is where the formula's deeper intelligence finally reveals itself, because focus and diversification are not contradictory ideas, they are sequential ones. Galloway is explicit that your human capital, the talent you sharpen for income, should remain concentrated and undiversified for as long as possible, while your financial capital, the money that talent eventually produces, must immediately begin spreading itself across uncorrelated ground the moment it exists. Concentrate to earn it. Diversify to protect it. That single reversal quietly resolves more financial anxiety than most entire books manage to address. And there it is, the full equation finally standing complete in front of you. Wealth equals focus, plus the product of Stoicism, time and diversification multiplied together, which means a complete collapse in any single multiplied variable could drag the entire output towards zero, no matter how strong the others remain. This is where mainstream advice usually stops, satisfied with a slogan. The vault perspective on this is different because an equation this exposed is not a comfort, it is an instruction. But just when the formula feels fully solved, Galloway adds one final condition that redefines everything. None of these variables work in isolation if you ignore the single force that can override them all, the quiet, daily decision to apply them even when no one is watching. And what comes next is where everything you have heard so far finally connects into something you can actually use, the key lessons and insights. The first lesson this entire formula teaches us, and arguably the one most people resist the longest, is something Galloway calls talent beats passion. Every time. Passion, as he describes it across both the book and his public writing, is frequently mistaken for a hobby, and hobbies tend to live inside industries that simply do not pay. Talent, by contrast, is observable, testable, and improves the more deliberately you exploit it, which makes it a far more reliable foundation for an actual career strategy than a feeling you currently happen to enjoy. Apply this immediately by separating what you enjoy from what you are demonstrably good at, because Galloway's own argument is that greatness eventually manufactures its own passion through admiration, income, and momentum. Stop auditioning careers based on how they feel in the first week and start auditioning them based on evidence of skill, output, and traction over time. That single shift in the valuation criteria alone can redirect an entire decade of career decisions towards something that actually compounds. The second lesson, and one of the quieter open loops this book resolves, is what Galloway calls the character tax. Remember the question we opened with about why intelligent, hardworking people still feel like they are losing. Part of the answer sits here inside the Stoic foundation of temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice. Without character governing daily behavior, income simply leaks out to manufactured wants disguised as needs, no matter how impressive the paycheck behind it happens to be. Apply this by treating every non-essential purchase as a decision your future self either thanks you for or resents you over. Galloway's insight about capitalism manufacturing desire is not a reason for guilt. It is a diagnostic tool. Use it before spending, not after, and you will notice within weeks how many purchases were never genuinely needs at all, simply needs you had been persuaded to feel. The third lesson is the waterline principle, Galloway's method for understanding the true floor beneath your financial life. Knowing your waterline budget means knowing precisely what survival actually costs you, separate from lifestyle inflation, status spending, or comparison-driven habits absorbed from people around you. Most people have never calculated this number, which means they are navigating their entire financial life without knowing where the actual danger line sits beneath them. Apply this lesson by calculating your real waterline this week, then building your daily, intermediate, and long-term consumption buckets around that number rather than around your income. This single exercise often reveals that the gap between current spending and actual necessity is far larger than most people are emotionally prepared to admit, and that gap is exactly where future wealth quietly begins accumulating. The fourth lesson is concentrate, to earn, diversify, to protect, the structural heartbeat of Galloway's entire formula. Your human capital, meaning your skills, your focus, your developing expertise, should stay narrow and undiversified while you are building it, because depth creates value faster than breadth does. Once that value converts into actual money, the rules invert completely, and protection through spreading risk becomes the priority instead of further concentration. Apply this by auditing where you currently sit on that spectrum. If you are early in your earning years, resist the urge to diversify your time and attention across too many pursuits. If you already have meaningful savings, resist the opposite temptation to concentrate too heavily into one exciting asset, even one you feel certain about, because certainty is precisely the emotion Galloway's 3% rule was designed to override. The fifth and final lesson is time is the variable you cannot refinance, and it deserves to land exactly as heavily as it sounds. Every other input in Galloway's formula can theoretically be improved later through effort, learning, or correction. Time is the single exception, because every day spent without compounding working in the background is a day permanently subtracted from the final outcome, regardless of how talented or disciplined you eventually become afterward. Apply this today, not next month, by automating even a small contribution toward long-term savings before you do anything else with new income. Galloway's warning about social media stealing exactly the years when relationships and serious work compound most effectively is not abstract. It is a direct challenge to how you are likely spending your evenings right now. And that brings us to the second question we opened with at the very beginning of this video, the vault closing. The Algebra of Wealth is not really a book about spreadsheets, percentages, or asset classes, even though it teaches all three with genuine precision. It is a book about the quiet, persistent gap between who you currently are financially and who you privately believe you are capable of becoming. Galloway built this formula after living through his own expensive collisions with overconfidence, and what makes the book land so differently is that he is not lecturing from above the problem. He is reporting back from inside it. Here is your specific action for the next 7 days. Calculate your actual waterline budget, the true core of what survival costs you, and then identify exactly one recurring expense that exists only because it felt like a need when it was actually a want manufactured by something designed to extract your attention. Cancel or reduce that one expense before the weekends. This is not about deprivation. It is about reclaiming the first small piece of evidence that the formula is now working in your favor instead of against you. And remember that first question we opened with about why nobody tells you that talent matters more than passion before you choose a career path. The honest answer is that the people benefiting from your passion rarely have an incentive to redirect you toward your talent instead. If you found genuine value in this strategic breakdown, like this video, subscribe to the Book Vault, and comment below with a single takeaway that hit hardest. Because this channel exists for ambitious people who refuse to accept average, and your next unfair advantage is already waiting in the next masterclass.